I first spoke about the London at the 2015 NAS conference, so that was 5 years ago now already. But at that time, we only just started work on it and we were in the very early stages. 2 years later, the theme of the NAS conference was "Discovery is only the beginning." And this phrase has stuck with me ever since. It is especially true for archaeological discoveries where a lot of detail is revealed during the post-excavation phase. And this information often puts the meat on the bone, so to speak, or provides the level of detail that we all find so fascinating. So during my talk, I would like to draw your attention to the extensive post-excavation program that took place following the recovery of over 700 small finds from the wreck of the London. I will share some results with you and shall outline how close collaboration between a multidisciplinary project team can contribute to our understanding not only of this wreck, but also contribute to our knowledge of this period of naval history. The London is one of 54 protected wrecks. It is situated in the Thames estuary, very close to a busy shipping lane. This location puts the wreck at risk, which is indicated by shifting sediment levels and exposed artifacts. One way to combat the risk to an archaeological site is to deepen our knowledge about it. Historic England has been working alongside the licensing team, providing training and support for surface recoveries made by the wreck licensees. In addition to that, Historic England has also funded excavation work on the site. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the history of the London, but it might be useful to repeat this here to just set the scene. The London was built in 1656, and it was part of the fleet that in May 1660 transported King Charles II to England during the restoration of the monarchy. And it so happened that just on Friday, as one does, I was mooching about on Twitter and I came across this painting, which was posted by the Rijksmuseum of Amsterdam. And as you can see by the title of this painting here, it depicts actually the departure of Charles II of England from, I believe it's pronounced Scheveningen. And the date here is June the 2nd in 1660. So there might be some debate as to when Charles II actually came back to England. But I think it's a great painting. This obviously was a quite an event. There's a big gathering here. And if you look at this scene here at the foreground, there's a lot of staring and pointing going on. On the beach here, we've got a couple of cannons lined up and one has just been fired. And then, of course, we've got the ships painted here in the background, and one of those might actually show the London. So this involvement of the London, of bringing Charles II back to England, obviously hugely contributes to the ship's historical and archaeological value. Moving on, in 1665, at the beginning of the Second Anglo-Dutch War, the London was torn apart by a massive gunpowder explosion. The event was famously recorded by Samuel Pepys in his diary. And this is great for us in archaeology, where we can consult historic documents and use them to enhance the actual archaeology we are working on. The wreck of the London was rediscovered in 2005 during work in advance of the London Gateway port. In October 2008, the site was designated under the Protection of Wrecks Act. From 2010 onwards, a group of local diving volunteers have started to monitor the wreck under the direction of site licensee Steve Ellis. And this monitoring indicated that the seabed sediments were unstable and that artifacts were being lost, which in 2012 led to the start of a program of finds recovery. Work on the site is very challenging due to low visibility, a highly tidal environment, and its location right next to the very busy shipping lane. In 2014, Historic England commissioned Cotswold Archaeology to undertake a 3-year evaluation of the site, to recover at-risk archaeology, to gain a better understanding of the vessel structure and deposits present and to assess the scale of threat from erosion. Finds recovery on the site of the London took place in two different ways: the ongoing surface recovery by the licensing team and time-limited underwater excavations run in parallel. During an excavation, a fairly large amount of artifacts is being recovered over a short period of time. During surface recovery, a small amount of artifacts are being recovered over a long period of time, and we're talking years here. This has challenged our project management approach. If we take a look at the usual project life cycle, this becomes clearer. So we start off with the recovery. Artifacts recovered from the marine environment require immediate first aid care. During the excavation, this was achieved by the project team. The licensing team had received training to deliver first aid for finds themselves. Documentation is crucial throughout all project stages, but when you're working with two different systems of artifact recovery, it is really important that the methods used for recording and documentation are married up and match each other. We normally then reach a point where the excavation comes to an end, where we stop recovering artifacts and move into the assessment phase. This is where we look closely at everything that has been that has been recovered, and assess its potential to answer research questions. But with the London project, we never really reached an endpoint, as the volunteer recoveries by the licensing team just kept on coming. In the end, we decided to impose an artificial endpoint, where, for the purpose of this project, we considered artifacts recovered up until a certain date only. The assessment phase is also used to plan the next stage, the analysis stage. The various specialists will look at their respective materials or artifact groups to get a brief overview of what is there, how much is there, what we need to do with it now, and crucially, how long will it take and how much will it cost. During the analysis phase is when things get really interesting. This is where we look even closer. We may establish material compositions, we may identify raw materials. This is where we collect more data related to the finds and interpret the results to tie them in with the wider site interpretation. Towards the end of a project, the archive will be deposited, in this case with Southend Museum Services. And depending on the size of your project, there will be an end of project report or a publication of some sort. And sometimes an exhibition will follow. But we all know that the reality can look quite different. Staying with the example of exhibitions, artifacts from the London have already featured in two temporary exhibitions, and 6 artifacts are on permanent display at the Stuart and Tudor Galleries at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. From a project management point of view, this was a little challenging at times, as we had to ensure that the artifacts on display were fast-tracked in terms of analysis and conservation, but also in terms of photography and illustration, as those artifacts that are now on display were not accessible for any outstanding work. And it is credit to all involved in bringing these exhibitions to fruition that this could be achieved when the project was still very much ongoing and live. I spoke about project management quite a bit already, so this is a good time to mention the project managers for the project, Cotswold Archaeology. The whole project team consisted of a myriad of different specialists to achieve the different objectives of this project. And it's very important to recognize the needs of each specialist, as some want to see the artifacts before, some after, and some even twice, before, after, and before conservation. But their work and contribution to a project of this scale are invaluable, and it is absolutely vital to ensure that channels of communication remain open to agree schedules, but to also share information and learn more from one another. Now, let's look at the work and some of the results in a bit more detail. The London and everything within were buried in silt for much of the past 355 years. And items such as leather and wood, which normally do not survive well on land, were beautifully preserved because of reduced oxygen levels. For me, one of the most exciting things to come across were the laces on the leather shoes. And you can see one example down here. And this is actually an example where the lace was still in place, actually closing the shoe. It's this level of contextual information that can tell us so much. Shoes in the 17th century were largely latchet style shoes. And at the time, some had decorative bows on them. You see how this shoe here has 4 holes in the tongue. 2 holes would hold the laces, and the other 2 could hold the a decorative ribbon. And this is exactly what we had present on one of the shoes from the London. Without the lace connecting the latchet to the tongue, the lace could have been interpreted as a rose, the decorative, often brightly colored ribbon that we know adorned some shoes at the time. All fibers were identified by Margarita Glaber. The lace in this example here of the shoe that I showed on the previous slide was made of silk, quite a noble material. We also undertook dye analysis. This was, however, inconclusive for all the laces that we've got on the, from the shoes. So when artifacts first arrive in the lab after an excavation, we often start with a program of X-radiography. These X-ray images will produce a record of the materials as found or aid in identification and subsequent conservation work. Like this hammer here, for example. The X-rays were used during deconcretion and working alongside the X-rays help to remove the overlying concretion to reveal the shape of the artifact. And the exact shape and size obviously forms part of the record for each artifact. And this is the sort of information that is important for the various specialists who will then look at other comparative samples and work on their typologies and dating evidence and such things. In other cases, the X-ray reveal interesting details that are not easily visible to the naked eye, like this pewter spoon, for example, where the X-ray showed a touch mark and the initials BA. In his work, find specialist Jörn Schuster established that the owner of this spoon was a bachelor. As for a married man, you would expect to find 3 letters consisting of first name initials of the couple at the bottom and the last name initial at the top arranged in a triangle. However, he also says that this sort of triangular system of 3 initials is only relevant to England. In Scotland, they have a different system where the 4 initials are being shown. During conservation work, we will remove artifacts from concretions, like this pair of calipers here. This one was embedded in a large lump of concretion, and just one part of it was exposed on the surface. As you can see here, one arm of the calipers is sticking out already. The other part of the calipers that was protected inside the concretion is much better preserved as it was not exposed to higher oxygen levels and the abrasive action of the seabed sediment. And you can see the other part here with the markings still beautifully preserved, and such great level of preservation where you can still take readings of the calipers. Removing the overlying corrosion and concretion layers will also aid desalination, which is a constant battle when you are engaged with maritime conservation. This cannonball, as seen in the center of the slide here, was perfectly preserved under thick layers of concretion and is now sitting in a bath of sodium hydroxide to wash out the chlorides. Removing iron staining, such as illustrated here on this leather sole, will not only improve the appearance of artifacts, but will be beneficial in the long run, as iron corrosion products will keep corroding and can interact with the various materials. Some of the more unusual recoveries from the London included 5 candle fragments. Although light would have played a huge role on any ship of this size, mainly to illuminate lower decks, we do sometimes find lanterns, the actual medium that creates the light is strangely scarce from the archaeological record. The candle fragments were analyzed using an infrared spectrometer, and this established they were made of beeswax, which gives a much cleaner and less smelly flame compared to tallow. Here is an example of where we work closely with our material science colleagues. When cleaning one of the leather book covers, different colored patches were noted. This was investigated using a non-destructive method of chemical analysis called X-ray fluorescence, or XRF for short. And here you can see the leather book cover before conservation. And what we suspected to be gilding can be seen on the edge here and then enlarged there again. So just very, very faint, small remains in a little bit of tooling on the leather, just a sort of a thin line was still there. Amazingly though, the underside, so that is the inside of the cover, showed some red staining under the turn ends. I realize the image doesn't show this very well, but the red staining could be found here under the turn ends. Those are the little flaps that go over the board of the book and hold the boards in place. XRF analysis confirmed that areas of gold and some red paint survived on a leather book cover, showing that the cover was originally an elaborate and costly item. The red paint was the mercury-based pigment vermilion, and this is quite an expensive pigment and was often mixed with cheaper materials. In this case, it had been mixed with red lead oxide. Amazingly, some remains of the board also survived. In this case, the book boards were not made of wood, but they were actually cardboard. So at this time, you would buy the text block separately and then take your text block to a bookbinder to have it encased in a leather book cover of your choice. And the cardboard covers were often made reusing old pieces of paper and by pasting them together. And the fibers, so we could see little remains of this paper sort of stuck to the inside of this book cover. The fibers were very poorly preserved, but could be distinguished as a bast fiber. This demonstrates that despite the site being at risk, the level of preservation for materials such as pigments and paper are extremely high. One artifact group that in the past has sometimes probably been overlooked is rope. And for those who attended Colin Martin's opening talk, he made this really interesting observation that in the past, artifacts that don't hold a monetary value were often not recovered. And I think rope absolutely falls into this category. We obviously know that rope played an really crucial role on any ship and would have been used, extensively for all the various tasks. And we have quite a lot of rope from the London. And the typical decay patterns involve separation, but also flattening and squashing, iron staining from nearby iron artifacts, and then total disintegration. And in conservation, we have a bit of a problem. If material is not recovered regularly, no one looks into conservation options. And rope is a funny thing that sort of falls in between wood and textile. It's neither wood, it's neither textile, but it's sort of quite often made of a woody material, in this case, bast fibers again. And almost worked using textile techniques, sort of plaiting and not weaving, but plaiting and twisting. But there is not a great body of sort of evidence or literature to go on when it comes to conservation. Here we see some close-ups. The rope was studied by Des Pawson, a roper, and he looked at the technological aspects, so the making of the rope. And we do have some interesting aspects here where we have evidence of worming or evidence of serving that was implied over the as an outer layer to the rope. And this was another example where we had to ensure that the two specialists were actually talking to each other. So Des would establish how the rope was made and say something about the different components. And then Margarita, who looked at the fibers again, had to make sure that she would sample from each component that the rope was made of. So in some cases, we would have to take 3 fiber samples. So from the rope itself, then from the worming, and then again from the serving. And that just tells you something about the mindset almost of the people that made the rope and the raw materials that they had available. In order to sort of come up with a solution of how to conserve the rope, I ran a few trials, and I used these very fragmented little strands from one piece and submerged them in different grades and concentrations of PEG, that's polyethylene glycol. And I've also done some air drying and solvent drying. And if we look at the results, I'm not showing the air drying and solvent drying results here. As you can imagine, those results were less successful as almost expected. But when you're running trials, it's always good to also include sort of extreme options either end of the spectrum to just give you a wider variety of options, really. So this is these little strands after conservation, so impregnation and then vacuum freeze drying. And although there were 1 or 2 favorites, the PEG 1500 performed quite well, especially at the lower concentrations. When I scaled this up and actually worked on larger pieces of rope, I have to say I wasn't so happy with the results. And in the end, I decided to just give it a go and almost do nothing to the rope. So this is this is the largest piece of rope we have from the London that just come out of the vacuum freeze dryer 2 weeks ago. And this was pre-frozen and then vacuum freeze dried without any impregnation. And I'm quite happy with the results. It looks very pleasing. It's preserved the shape and dimensions really well. And although the NAS have done a great job putting on such a fantastic virtual conference here, what I can't share with you is the smell of this piece of rope. The lab is currently filled with a beautiful aromatic smell of tar, much to the delight of everyone who occasionally visits us at the moment. Okay, moving on. Here, I would like to draw your attention to the work of my colleague Sarah Painter, a material scientist, who, amongst other things, has also looked at the material composition of the various glass objects. A closely dated assemblage like from the London can consolidate and further refine our knowledge on changes in glass composition throughout time. But it can also tell us where glass was produced, and this gives an insight into trade and exchange. In the mid 17th century, when the London was lost, most windows and bottles were made from common green glass, as can be seen on the images at the bottom of the slide here. Colorless glass was reserved for selected objects like the best drinking glasses. We have a few examples from the London, and one very remarkable survival is a pocket sundial that contained a colorless glass lens, and this is this beautiful thing here. And it still magnifies today, which is quite incredible for us to experience. The rectangle of glass here on the right hand side is again a colorless plate glass, and on one side it's got a beveled edge, and with a bit of exchange and toing and froing between various different specialists, Sarah came to the conclusion that this was probably from a mirror that has lost its reflective coating. One of the largest material groups recovered from the London was wood. My colleague Zoe Hazel, together with Emma Atkin from Cotswold Archaeology, undertook a large program of wood identifications. The aim of their work was first and foremost to enhance the archaeological record by identifying wood types, but then also to see if there is a correlation between artifact type and chosen raw material, as well as giving an insight into the availability of different woods at the time. Wood identifications are normally destructive, as illustrated here. One or more samples are being cut off the artifact and then viewed under magnification. This will show the cell structure, which differs for different wood types. For sample taking, Zoe and myself work closely together to ensure a representative amount of samples are being taken per artifact group, but also that samples were taken from already damaged or inconspicuous areas. Wood identifications are best undertaken before conservation. And so again, I had to work closely with Zoe to ensure that she's aware of the conservation schedule for the various wood artifacts, and that we would allow time for sample taking before anything was placed into active conservation. One large artifact category are the gunner's implements. This aspect of the project is being studied by Dan Pascoe and Alex Hildred. And all these gunner's implements taken together can be used to illustrate naval warfare of the mid-17th century. So here at the top, we've got an image of one of the many linstocks, which are used to fire the guns. Here is a close-up of one of the linstocks with a scorch mark in the shape of the rope that formed the slow match around the linstock. Then we've got two rummer heads. So one is shown here, two flexible rummer heads with the rope still inside. We have several complete handspikes and many incomplete handspike fragments, and these are used to maneuver the guns and the gun carriage. And here we've got a priming wire, which again is obviously used to pierce the charge in your cannons before firing. Now let's look a bit closer at what Zoe found out about the gunner's implements. Fraxinus, that is ash to you and me, is the dominant wood type used for the gunner's implements. Ash is a strong but also very elastic wood, and it has been used for making bows or tool handles or baseball bats, for example. So we can immediately see how the natural properties of ash were exploited for items such as the handspikes, which will have to be strong but also very resilient to withstand that leverage force that is placed on them when you come to maneuver the guns. But There were also cases where destructive sampling was simply not appropriate. There are two rare and completely preserved finds from the London: a pipe stopper, seen here on the left, and the tuning peg of a stringed instrument, seen on the right. For those, we decided not to take a sample, and we tried a different approach. We worked closely together with imaging specialists from the CT scan facilities at the University of Southampton, especially Katie Rankin. In collaboration with her, we developed a protocol for the non-destructive identification of wood using CT scanning. The results are very promising, and we hope to publish this work in a paper very soon. We took a similar approach when it came to the silver coins. This work was done by Katie Marston, again in collaboration with the University of Southampton. And we have two coin lumps, and that is a technical term, by the way. And here you can see the larger of the two coin lumps inside the CT scanner. It's securely mounted on the sample stage, which rotates around during the scanning process. This is the X-ray gun here. And over here, we've got the detector that collects the X-ray images that are being produced as the larger coin lump rotates around and is being exposed to X-rays. So what is really interesting is that CT scanning did not just allow us a non-destructive quantification and analysis of the coins, it also gave some interesting insights into the preservation. Coins on the outer perimeter of this coin bundle were, generally speaking, easier to image, as these areas were less dense than the center of the coin bundle. However, the coins on the edges were not as well preserved as the ones in the center, with the edges being corroded to a higher level. This also confirmed that taking this non-destructive approach was the right decision, as physical separation would not only have been very time-consuming, but would also jeopardize information that is embedded in very soft silver corrosion products and can still be seen in the CT scan images, but would probably not survive conservation cleaning. This slice demonstrates the changing preservation level through one coin. You can see the center is really well preserved, but the information on the edges has largely disappeared. The whole coin within its stack is surrounded by dense corrosion products, which is this ring here. By virtually orientating the whole coin lump and positioning slices either through a stack, like here at the top, you can quantify the number of coins present. And then by placing the slices through a coin, you end up with two images per coin, showing the obverse and reverse, which is then used for identification and dating. Now, before I start wrapping up, let me just talk a little bit about living conditions and hygiene. We don't know a lot about this simply because we did not excavate the wreck structure to that level. And although we can consult some historic references and hazard a pretty good guess, there is nothing like the real evidence of finding lice or other pests. I'm afraid, though, I am going to disappoint you. We did not find lice or fleas, but there are a few artifacts that allow us to think about what life on board could have been like. The pewter syringe, for example, was thoroughly checked for residues of mercury, as this was administered in syringes to treat venereal disease. However, we could not detect any. This ivory knit comb was carefully cleaned under the microscope, and the sediment was retained and then scanned for any parasites, but again, none were detected. Although in both cases we did not discover any conclusive evidence, it nevertheless shows that the crew at the time was concerned with personal hygiene and medical treatments. The London project has provided numerous outreach and learning opportunities. This has ensured that interest in the project remained high, but also that the sector benefited from further development opportunities. Access to artifacts by various specialists is crucial to post-excavation work, and a carefully planned program of sample taking, analysis, and conservation was put in place to ensure a smooth workflow. This project has been coordinated by Cotswold Archaeology and involved Historic England external and freelance specialists, as well as a licensing team for the London Rec. And although this project, the scientific analysis of the finds from the London, is coming to an end, this is by no means the end for the site. This year, Historic England has commissioned MSDS Marine to undertake remote sensing on the site, which was completed in May. The aim was to deliver high quality geophysical information to Historic England to enable the establishment of proactive management of the London wreck site through an understanding of the depths of buried stratigraphy across the site. This geophysical survey will be supplemented next year by a track diver survey, which will hopefully enable us to create a fully digitized and accurately positioned site plan. So, what's next for the London project? The various specialists have submitted their contributions to a project monograph, which will summarize the project from recovery to analysis results. We hope that this will be published next year. A number of papers have or shortly will be published in specialist journals. And then we are still faced with the task of depositing the project archive. If in the meantime you would like to find out more about the London, there is a recently updated project webpage. We also recently shared some of the results in the Historic England Research News magazine. Some results have already been published in the research report series, or you can explore the dive trail. And of course, you can stay up to date on our various social media channels. And that's it from me. Thank you so much.